Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Pronouns, including she, he, and they, are all appropriate. And I'll offer that Pauli Murray is a saint in the Episcopal Church, so Saint Pauli Murray is perfectly appropriate as well. I think that's beautiful because it certainly transcends all of our human understanding. With that, we will go ahead and hop in. I do have some slides to share today. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to share my screen. Wonderful. Okay. So we're going to dive into the conversation. If you've got questions that bubble up for you during the time that I'm talking, I'll ask that you hold them to the end because it's a bit difficult for me to navigate the slide, my notes, and the chat. But again, I'll work to leave ample time for questions towards the end of our conversation. And I think in that format, you can either pop your questions into the chat or just come off of mute, since there are not that many of us here today. Okay. So Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray was actually born Anna Pauline Murray in Baltimore, Maryland. You're going to see in the image that's towards the left side of your screen a purple circle that is hovering just above a child or surrounding a child's face. That is a very, very young Anna Pauline Murray. Pauli Murray was born in 1910 to Agnes Murray. Agnes Murray, Pauli's mother, is seated just to the right of Pauli in this image. And Pauli's father is William Murray, who you are going to see towards the far right of this image. And Pauli Murray is ultimately the fourth of six children. So again, you see Pauli's parents pictured there. Agnes Murray unfortunately passed away of a cerebral hemorrhage when Pauli was about 3 years old. And William Murray, who was already deeply, deeply depressed, was left unable to care for his six children upon his wife's death. He was also institutionalized in a mental hospital in Baltimore called Crownsville State Mental Hospital. So again, upon Agnes's passing and William Murray's incapacitation, most of the six children were sent to live with family members across the Baltimore area. But you're going to see someone that is standing just to the left of a young Pauli Murray in this image, and that is Agnes's sister, Pauline. And Pauline is the person for whom a young Anna Pauline Murray is named. Agnes and Pauline had a pact that if anything ever happens to me, Pauline, please take care of young Anna Pauline. And so unfortunately that day did come to pass, and Pauline comes to get Pauli Murray and moves Pauli to Durham in 1913 or 1914, when Pauli is about 3 or 4 years old. And so you're going to see to the right of your screen the home that Pauli was raised in, which is in Durham, North Carolina. Pauli was raised in the historically Black, historically working class neighborhood of the West End in Durham, North Carolina. In this home that's pictured, that was built by her grandfather in 1898. Pictured on the left side of the screen, you are going to see Pauli Murray's grandparents. The gentleman that is seated is Robert Fitzgerald, Pauli Murray's maternal grandfather, and the woman that is standing just behind him is Cornelia Smith Fitzgerald, Pauli Murray's maternal grandmother. I'll offer that these are very, very interesting folks in their own right. Typically, with a bit more time, I would go into more of their background, but I'll offer that these are incredible people to study and to learn about. Oftentimes, when um, I talk about Pauli Murray, it's important for me to remind folks that nobody remarkable or nobody who does remarkable things happens in a vacuum. And that is certainly the case for Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray grows up in a loving household, again, raised by her grandparents, by her aunt Pauline, who you see pictured here, as well as another aunt named Sally Fitzgerald Small. So this is a non-traditional household. This is a multi-generational household. Many people in the household are educators and have a different series of complex and complicated relationships um, with race, with notions of citizenship, of Black liberation, of justice and equality. And so it is really this um, complex and complicated, loving home that shapes Pauli Murray into a very self assured young child, a self assured young child that is very clear about what it means for Black people to live whole, free, dignified lives, who has some very early concepts of democracy, of justice, and of equality. And again, you don't get that self assured young Pauli Murray with those clear ideas and ideals without these folks that you see on your screen. If you're interested in learning more about these people and their rich and compelling lives, it's going to be included in one of the resources that I invite you to take away, and a resource that we'll talk a little bit more about in our conversation today. But Pauli Murray does write a beautiful, sweeping memoir that includes beautiful vignettes of these folks and their lives and how they came to shape her. So, again, let's remember no one remarkable happens in a vacuum. And Pauli's family went a long way into shaping her into the confident, clear, and self assured activist that she would become. To that point, Pauli attended primarily segregated schools in Durham, North Carolina, including Lyon Park Elementary School, where both of her aunts were teachers, and the historically Black Hillside High School. And I'll offer that this creates a pathway to what we might consider one of Pauli's earliest forms of protests. While Pauli's neighborhood and historically Black neighborhood institutions provided her a great deal of safety, it is what happened outside of that enclave that was transformative to Pauli. What happened in the streets every day in Durham, North Carolina, segregated Jim Crow era Durham, North Carolina, really led Pauli to, again, an early act of protest. And that act of protest is wanting to get out of Durham, North Carolina, really wanting to divorce herself, if you will, from the Jim Crow era South. And so she aspired to attend an integrated college and ultimately moved to New York City to receive a second diploma so that she could meet the entrance requirements to Hunter College in New York City. And so she does so. She gets that second diploma in 1927 from Richmond Hills High School, and then ultimately enrolls in Hunter College. And these images give you a sense of what Pauli Murray looked like during their college days. I'll offer that when Pauli enrolls in Hunter College, she moves to Harlem. She stays for a time at the Harlem YWCA, as well as different apartments and rooms in Harlem. And late 20s, early 1930s, Harlem was a dynamic place for Pauli to be, another enclave of Black thought, Black creativity, and Black expression. And some of what this means for Pauli is that she has some freedom to express both her sexual identity and her gender identity. And so it's this time in Pauli's life, again, as a young college student, where Pauli begins to explore what it might mean to live out what she's actually feeling on the inside. From childhood, Pauli Murray felt like she was in the wrong body. Even her Aunt Pauline would call Pauli my little boy girl. And so I want to make sure that folks can hear me. Seems that my headphones might have disconnected. Are we able to hear me still? Thumbs
Yes.
up? Wonderful. Okay. Okay, so even as a child, Aunt Pauline would call Pauli my little boy girl. And so Pauli begins to experiment with gender affirming care around this time. This is the earliest point at which they are seeking hormone therapy. They're connected with doctors who can help them explore those possibilities. Pauli is also experimenting with a different series of names. So we know that Pauli, in some of her very early poetry writings, is going by names that include Dave, Dude, and Paul. And so this is groundbreaking in its own right. Again, exploring hormone therapy in the 30s. And again, this navigating gender identity and gender expression. Ultimately, Pauli lands on the name Pauli. So shifting her name from Anna Pauline Murray to the gender neutral Pauli Murray at this point in their life. And that is a form of gender expression, of resistance, of claiming an identity that carries Pauli through their life. Now, Pauli Murray graduated from Hunter College at the age of 23 in 1933 with a degree in English literature. It is 2025. It is hard enough to get a job in English lit in 2025. And so we can imagine how difficult it might have been in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression. Frankly, it was nearly impossible for Pauli to live out that original aspiration of being a writer. And so Pauli Murray is ultimately hired by the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. The WPA enables Pauli, or employs Pauli in her efforts to teach adult literacy and labor organizing across New York City, which ultimately motivated Pauli's second aspiration, which was to be a sociologist. It is Pauli's working with working class people, navigating social issues, class issues, and race issues that are all inextricably intertwined, that leads Pauli to think about, how might I met out or dismantle race-based discrimination? Maybe the first way I can do that is socially or sociologically. And so I want to study sociology as a graduate student. Pauli applies to study sociology at UNC Chapel Hill as a graduate student and is ultimately denied entry because of her race. And this is another key takeaway, and a fact that you can kind of stick in your pocket if you wish. A lot of folks think that Pauli was denied entry to study at UNC Chapel Hill to attend law school, but it was not law school. It was, again, to be a sociologist. This leads to what would be another one of Pauli's acts of protest, and what kind of puts Pauli on a pathway towards civil rights activism. Again, Pauli is denied entry to law school and ultimately mounts a letter writing campaign, just amplifying her case across the country to leaders and decision makers. Pauli also appeals to the NAACP. She thinks this will be a really great test case because the NAACP is doing work to integrate institutions like the University of North Carolina across the country. Ultimately, the NAACP does not pick up Murray's case. They think it is too weak. And Pauli uh, fails in this attempt or this series of appeals to gain entry to UNC Chapel Hill. But I'll offer that one of Pauli's letters makes it across the desk of somebody that you're seeing on this screen, one Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt is very compelled by this young firebrand, as she calls Pauli. She wants to learn more about the Jim Crow South and Pauli Murray's ideals around integration and equality and equity. And it is this that leads to what will go on to be a lifelong friendship between Pauli Murray and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Now we're at a place where Pauli Murray is out of a job. And so, out of a job, not in graduate school, certainly needs something to do to make a living, and is ultimately hired by an organization called the Workers' Defense League to advocate for the rights of wrongfully incarcerated Black people in the South. It's also around this time that Pauli and a friend of hers named Adeline McBean are arrested in Virginia for refusing to give up their seat on a bus. This is around 1939, 1940. This might sound familiar to us. Something else that we're going to learn is that Pauli was an architect, and in so many spaces and so many places, she did it first. It's this series of events, again, advocating for the rights of incarcerated Black people in the South, this arrest in Virginia, that leads Pauli to yet another aspiration. She's saying, okay, I can't upend race-based discrimination sociologically. They're not going to let me into to Chapel Hill, but maybe I can uproot Jim Crow, the era of legal segregation, legally. I'm going to give that a shot. And so the next thing that Pauli Murray does is enroll at Howard University School of Law in 1940 or 1941. And if you look closely at your screen, on the bottom row, second to the right, you will see Pauli Murray pictured. And something else that you'll notice immediately is that she is the only woman in her class in this image. This led Pauli to not have such a good time in law school. She was ridiculed by her male classmates, all but ignored by her male professors. And it's this experience that leads her to coin the term Jane Crow to describe the dual experience of experiencing segregation as someone who is both Black and someone who is a woman. And this is another one of Pauli's architecture moments. This is the grandparent term to a term that we might be more familiar with today, Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. It's also at Howard University School of Law that Pauli deepens her civil rights activism. Pauli works to mount some of the earliest sit-ins to integrate restaurants in Washington, D.C., and also supports undergraduate students at mounting protests and other forms of direct action to challenge segregation at Washington, D.C. And this is in the 1940s, well before the height of what we consider the modern civil rights movement. Despite Pauli's experiences and treatment in law school, she graduated top of her class in 1944. And at the time, anyone who graduated at the top of their class from Howard, a historically Black college, was entitled to study at Harvard University to receive their Master of Law. And I'm going to ask you all to hop in here. Pauli Murray gets rejected from Harvard University, though she's entitled to it. She is not able to pursue that Master of Law at Harvard. Why does she get rejected from Harvard? Is it because she's Black or because she's a woman? Go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat, or you can come off mute. Is it because she's Black or because she's a woman? Okay, I see some chats coming through. Thank you. If you offered that Pauli was denied entry to Harvard because she is a woman, you are correct. At the time, Harvard was accepting Black people, but was still a men's only law school. And so this is why Pauli does not get in. This is another place where she appeals, she pushes, she fights, but ultimately those appeals do not succeed. Pauli ultimately ends up enrolling in what is now the University of California, Berkeley School of Law to pursue that Master of Law. And Pauli, at the time, should have been completing her senior thesis at Howard University, but she got a little bit busy fighting Harvard, and so did not quite get to completing that senior thesis. And it's ultimately the racism that Pauli experiences in California that reminds her, hey, I've got this thesis to finish. And this is a reminder that racism and anti-Blackness, they're not Southern phenomenon, they're national phenomenon, they're global phenomenon. But again, Pauli moves to California, is treated poorly because of her race. She moves there with her sister, and they both have horrible experiences. So she returns to that senior paper and ultimately mails it back to her professors to just complete that final requirement for her JD. The theory that Pauli Murray put forth in that paper was used a decade later to successfully argue Brown versus Board of Education before the United States Supreme Court. So there goes Pauli again, the architect. And you might have guessed it, this group of gentlemen, some of whom we revere, did not give Pauli Murray credit for developing that theory that they ultimately used, did not give Pauli Murray credit for her work. And she would not learn that this team used her theory or used that paper until many, many years later. I think she was in her 50s and paying a visit back to Howard University's campus. And one of her former professors, who was an old guy, then was like, hey, by the way, we used your paper, and he paid her $10 for it. And so that also gives you a sense of that lasting disrespect, right? That was just sort of ingrained in the culture of that institution. Pauli followed her time in California with a brief stint as a legal clerk in New York City, as well as some time in private practice. And in 1948, gave politics a try. She ran for city council in New York City for Brooklyn's 10th senatorial district. And though she did not win, she did have the fourth number of highest votes. In 1951, at the age of 41, Pauli Murray was commissioned by the Women's Division of Christian Service of the United Methodist Church to write a book called States' Laws on Race and Color, which would go on to be an over 700-page survey of race-based laws in the United States. This group thought that when they first commissioned Pauli to do the work, this was going to be a little pamphlet. And again, it went on to be an over 700-page compendium that Thurgood Marshall called the Bible for civil rights litigators during the height of the civil rights movement. So there goes Pauli Murray, the activist, again. Now, this time in her life, Pauli, again, is in her early to mid 40s and decides to take a break from legal work to return back to that original aspiration of being a writer. And so Pauli takes some time to write the book that you see pictured on the left-hand side of your screen called Proud Shoes, and it is published in 1956. This is that sweeping memoir I was speaking to at the beginning of our conversation today. It is considered one of the earliest literary chronicles of Black American life and a Black American family. And if you're familiar with Roots, it precedes the more well-known Roots of the 1970s. I'll offer that it was met with mixed reactions during its release, and ultimately was unsuccessful. It did not sell well because folks felt that it was divisive at a time of racial unrest in our country. So ultimately, this book sold less than 5,000 copies. It was re-released about 20 years later in 1978, following the success of Roots. And at that time, it was much better received. The royalties that Pauli received from the 1978 release allowed Pauli to make her first and only luxury purchase, which was a Mercedes. And so I'm really grateful that, again, Pauli push for that book to be released many, many years later. But this book is available to you. It is something that I highly recommend. And again, is in your resource packet that I'll leave for you today. Pauli, after writing this book, returns back to practicing law just to get a bit more stability, and is ultimately hired by the esteemed law firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, is the first Black woman associate to be hired by that firm. It's here that Pauli Murray meets her longtime romantic partner, Irene Barlow. After practicing at Paul Weiss for a few years, Pauli Murray is invited in 1960 to teach constitutional law in Ghana. And so Pauli takes her architecture work global. In addition to, again, teaching constitutional law, she helps leaders of the newly independent nation of Ghana think about how to structure their constitution. So there goes Pauli Murray, the architect, again. And after this time in Ghana, where Pauli taught for just about a year, I believe, Pauli Murray returned back to the United States, where she was tapped by civil rights leaders to help do some infrastructure building work for the civil rights movement. They recognized all of the work that Pauli had done in the 1940s. They recognized the value of that compendium, states' laws on race and color. And so, again, wanted Pauli from an infrastructure and architecture perspective, really, to help build, grow, and sustain the civil rights movement. Pauli did that work for a while, but ultimately walked away from the civil rights movement because of male leaders' treatment of women in the movement. I'll also offer that this is a time where Pauli Murray writes that her feminist consciousness is growing. So it's not surprising to me that with that rising consciousness, she chose to walk away from the movement at the time that she did. She did play a role, a compelling role in the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in this era, but it's less from the sort of African American civil rights perspective and more from the women and gender rights perspective. Specifically, Pauli Murray was crucial to advocating for the inclusion of the word sex in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And her advocacy was successful, and ultimately helped to make sex discrimination, specifically in the workplace, unconstitutional. Pauli Murray does this advocacy primarily through a 40-page memo that's a really, really compelling read. And if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, I have a whole talk on this subject, you might imagine. So you're welcome to have me back to talk about that. So Pauli Murray has done a lot. It is 1965. Pauli is 55 years old. We think maybe she might take a break, but no, she does not. Pauli Murray ultimately returns to school. Pauli Murray enrolls at Yale University to pursue a doctorate of law, or a JSD degree, and ultimately receives that achievement, that accolade, in 1965 at the age of 55. And so ultimately, Pauli Murray is the first African American male, woman, or otherwise to receive a doctorate of law from Yale University. Pauli Murray's feminist consciousness is continuing to grow. It is continuing to crystallize. And so it's also at this time in her life, in alignment with her continued advocacy for the rights of women, that Pauli begins advocating for what she calls a civil rights organization, or an NAACP for women, to be established. And she kind of circulates this idea with an underground network of feminists for many, many years before this idea feels ripe to actually materialize. And ultimately, Pauli Murray works alongside a group of feminists to found the National Organization for Women in 1966. And so Pauli is a co-founder of NOW in 1966. We know NOW is foundational to the women's movement and still a revered women's rights advocacy organization to this day. Beyond founding NOW, I'll offer that NOW co-leaders tapped Pauli to build the framework for the organization. So there goes Pauli Murray, the architect, again. Additionally, Pauli Murray advocated amongst her co-founders and amongst her co-leaders for broad inclusion of the needs of women in this organization. Specifically, she argues that NOW needs to consider the needs of Black women in their advocacy, and that NOW leadership should consider the skills and talents of Black women when considering future leaders, regardless of class. These two positions put Pauli in a very unpopular spot and ultimately led movement leaders and NOW leaders to isolate themselves from Pauli. And so Pauli Murray ultimately walked away from the National Organization for Women, and largely from the feminist movement, due to white feminist leaders' unwillingness to really come to a clear understanding of creating expansive opportunities to meet the needs of Black women and to create leadership opportunities expansively for Black women. In the late 1960s to early 1970s, Pauli Murray spent time working at universities across the country, including Benedict College, a historically Black college in South Carolina, and Brandeis University in Massachusetts. And she ultimately secured tenure at Brandeis. It's also this time in her life where Pauli returns back to that aspiration of being a writer and published a book of poetry called Dark Testament that I'll include in your resource packet. I'll also offer, largely due to her grandmother, Pauli Murray was a cradle Episcopalian and was a devout Episcopalian. And so this growing feminist consciousness led her to work alongside her partner, Irene Barlow, to advocate for the inclusion of women in broad levels of leadership in the Episcopal Church. And so that is another way that her feminist activism is showing up at this time in her life. The death of Irene Barlow, Pauli's partner, who you see here on the left side of your screen, served as a major turning point in Pauli's life. Again, they are working hand in hand to push the Episcopal Church. Pauli is still working and not working necessarily by choice, but because she has to. Pauli is older, is wrestling with her own mortality, and so just finds herself in a tough spot. And then her partner passes away. And also, these movements that she had contributed a lifetime of work to had ultimately alienated her. And so she finds herself estranged from major movements, estranged from the Episcopal Church, and in a place of deep, deep grief as she wrestles with Irene's death and the realities of her own mortality. And she writes in her memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, in spite of my vigorous advocacy of women's ordination in the Episcopal Church as a matter of principle, my age and sense of unworthiness had insulated me against entertaining such a possibility for myself. It had taken a cataclysm, watching Irene in an abyss of suffering, to force my submission and obedience to divine will. Now that will seemed to be leading me into the unknown on a journey that demanded utmost faith and trust. And so at the age of 62, Pauli enters seminary to become a priest at a time where the Episcopal Church is not accepting women as priests and had just started accepting women in seminary. Pauli Murray was the only Black woman in her cohort, was not particularly popular amongst her cohort mates, had a really tough time in seminary, and writes that she did not meet, that her classmates argued that she did not meet the personality requirements of being a priest. Who her classmates or cohort mates said that she was not pastoral, abrasive, and rude, which is harmful, right? As a woman, and if there are any Black women in this space, that's something that we hear on an everyday or every week basis, at least. And yet we know there is joy on the other side. In 1977, at the age of 67, Pauli Murray became the first Black woman to be ordained by the Episcopal Church as a priest. And she offered the Eucharist for the first time on February 13th, 1977, at Chapel of the Cross, the same church where her grandmother Cornelia was baptized as an enslaved child. Pauli Murray was later sainted by the Episcopal Church. So, to my comment earlier, Saint Pauli is perfectly appropriate. Pauli Murray spent her final years preaching and teaching across the country. She never had a home church, and also writing her memoir, Song in a Weary Throat, which I've included in my resource packet for you. Song in a Weary Throat is the last thing that Pauli Murray wanted to do, give an accounting to the world of her life and everything that she contributed to humanity. But she ultimately passed away at the age of 74 in 1985, writing this memoir. But friends and family came together to ensure that it was published in 1987. I'm really grateful for you all allowing me to share just a little bit about Pauli Murray's life today and what she contributed to humanity. I want to honor our time. I could go on, but I do want to hold space for question and answer. I was told that we would want to hold about 15 minutes for Q&A. So at this point, I'm going to drop the slide so that you all can see me and we can talk to one another and have a conversation about anything that's on your spirit or any questions that you'd like me to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Angela. Such an interesting talk. And I have one question just to kick us off. I learned about Pauli Murray about 3 or 4 years ago and immediately read some of her books and watched the documentary. And I was so blown away with what she had accomplished. But I have the question for you, why has it taken so long for her name and her incredible life to come forward more than it had in the past as a leader, as an activist, and so forth? I'm just curious why she hasn't been in the pantheon of civil rights and feminist leaders for a lot longer.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the way that I like to think about this is we don't know as much as we should about Pauli because of who she was in terms of identity and because of how she worked. Um, Pauli was a Black woman. And so just being a Black woman, I think automatically rendered her to a certain level of invisibility. I spoke to how she was treated as a Black woman in both the civil rights and feminist movements, arguably the movements that she contributed the most to. But again, I think it's her Black womanhood that made her less visible. Certainly, polysexuality is a factor, though this is something that Pauli was fairly private about. I think, particularly in the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, it's something that folks suspected. And if you're familiar with how queer people were treated in either one of those movements, it's not very well, right? So that's another reality. Um, and then again, I think the third factor is how Pauli Murray worked. Pauli Murray was a strategy person, an infrastructure person, right? She really helped to build the root of movements, the fabric of movements, which means she wasn't flashy, right? She's not out front giving the speeches or at the front of marches per se. She does not necessarily have that flashy role. And I don't know that we always pay respect to how people work, especially if they've not necessarily held a flashy position in movement work. And so that's what I would offer is to three factors that have rendered Pauli Murray not as well known as she should be today.
Thank you. I see Pam and
And
Mark.
Yes, I've been involved with veteran feminists for a long time, and we did a program on her several years ago in Chapel Hill, and actually went there. I think a lot of women in now understood what had happened to Pauli and are trying to obviously remedy that. And so a lot of us really know a lot about Pauli Murray. And I think the thing that we really tried to promote was her adding the word sex into the Civil Rights Bill, because it's so foundational and so important. And so a lot of the older feminists are in now especially are really lauding her a lot. So I didn't learn a lot today because I've read a lot about Pauli Murray, and I'm very glad that Women's Voices has, included her. And also, I recently watched the PBS program on the women who became priests in the Episcopal Church, and they do talk a little about Pauli and how she wasn't really keen about the whole movement, but eventually realized, oh yeah, I got to be there. So I found she's a very interesting person who rethinks a lot of things. So I mean, there's a lot to know about Pauli Murray, and really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Of course, thank you, Pam. And that PBS documentary that Pam is referring to is about the Philadelphia 11. And this is a group of women who was they became priests in Episcopal priests in kind of a rogue way before the Episcopal Church officially began ordaining women. And that is a really interesting lens into feminist history, Episcopal history, Black history. It was a Black male Episcopal priest who created a pathway for that actually to happen in his historically Black Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. So very, very interesting watch. Thank you, Pam.
Yes, I'm glad that the very first question was, well, how did it take this long for her to come into like mainstream knowledge? But now that I know of her, I am in a book club for the first time in my 67 years of life with my granddaughter, who is who's in her mid-20s, and some of her friends. My granddaughter is biracial, and so they have me reading things that fairyland and all this good kind of stuff. But I would like, because at some point I'm going to get to pick a book. So this Proud Shoes, would that be a book that I should introduce to them potentially? Because I would like to believe that I could classify my granddaughter as being pretty socially active, activist on that spectrum there. So this would be a good book for me to introduce.
Yes, I would highly, highly recommend Proud Shoes for a few reasons. So one, the historian in me likes to raise up the fact that this is a genealogical work. Pauli Murray did really deep research, pre-computer. I don't even know how she did it to map the history of paternal and maternal sides of her family going back 2 or 3 generations. But it doesn't read like a boring history book. Again, it is a beautiful, sweeping novel. And some of what's really compelling about that book is the family's complicated relationship with race. You saw it in the images, but people look different phenotypically because of who they are. Pauli Murray's grandparents, each of them were mixed race people. They themselves come from mixed race families. Pauli Murray's family members have a history of passing into whiteness, which is a really complicated reality. And so all of that is intertwined in the book in really interesting and compelling ways. And I'll offer as a final point, it also paints a really interesting picture of what life was like during Reconstruction, which I remind folks, we say we're living in unprecedented times. We're not. And something like Proud Shoes can remind us of that reality. It paints a picture of what it felt like to live through the beginnings of Jim Crow. It paints a beautiful picture of Durham, North Carolina. And so it's just very compelling and something that I would highly recommend. And if you're looking for a place to start with Pauli Murray in terms of reading, anyone on this call, that's actually where I'd recommend that you start.
Thank you.
Of course. What else is bubbling up for us? Any other questions or thoughts?
I have one if no one else does. I would agree with you. That book is amazing, as I thought Jane Crow was, which is a biography by Jane Rosenberg, I think. We read that in a book club that I'm in, and we learned so much. So I would put that forward. I'm sure it's on your list. I'm curious a little about how the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice got started. I was amazed that it existed. I didn't know anything about it. So if you could give us a little background of the center and your work there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were established in 2012 out of neighborhood advocacy. Pauli Murray's childhood neighborhood has always been historically Black and historically working class, which means that it's experienced disinvestment since it was founded in 1898. Neighbors advocated for adequate investment to be made in our neighborhood, and that also looked like salvaging our neighborhood's historical treasures, including Pauli Murray's childhood home, which was slated for demolition at the time. So the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice rises out of this. And we hold as our mission to uplift the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Murray, to address enduring inequities and injustices today. And we do that in 4 different ways. One, preservation is critical. So preserving Pauli Murray's childhood home enables us to do this. Providing resources and trainings grounded in social justice social justice and equity-centered teaching pedagogy is another one of our priorities. We lift programs that enable us to move contemporary social justice work forward in the US South. So we're not a traditional house museum, if you will. Everything we do grounds in Pauli's activist framework, and again, gives us tools to move justice work forward. And then finally, we provide gathering, rest, and strategy space for institutions, individuals, and organizations that are aligned with Pauli's social justice work to do their work in our space. And I'll offer that this is something of a new 4-pronged vision for the center, because it took us a while to get here. From 2012 to 2024, we were actually working earnestly to preserve Pauli Murray's childhood home. And so I was hired specifically to wrap up that rehabilitation effort and to open Pauli Murray's childhood home to the public. And so we did that. We finally opened to the public last September and have really enjoyed the last 6 or 7 months or so of being a publicly open space that enables me to activate that 4-pronged vision that I just offered to you. So you can stay connected with us in a lot of ways. This is a brilliant way to do so. We have, again, virtual and in-person programs. If you're in North Carolina, you can come see me at the Pauli Murray Center. So in my resource packet, I'm going to link again how you can actually sign up for a visit, so you can be an even deeper relationship with Pauli Murray by coming to her childhood home. So thank you for that question. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and link our resource packet here for you. Lots of stuff in there. And then also, let me go ahead and put a link to how to visit us. Again, if you're here in North Carolina, you can pay us a visit in person. We also have a virtual tour available if you're not in North Carolina as well.
Well, I want to thank you so, so much for spending an hour of your very busy time, I'm sure, with our group, and for all the work you're doing at the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice. I'm inspired to try to get a pilgrimage up from St. Louis to bring a bunch of us down there. She is just always, she inspires me so much, and I think so many of us would learn more by being at that site. So again, we're very grateful, and thank you for offering your contact information. Also, I'm sure there are people here in this call that would like to continue to be in touch with you and with the center. So with
Yes,
that,
absolutely.
all right. Thanks again. We're at 1 o'clock.
Thank
So
you.
thank you all so much for attending. And thank you again, Ms. Thorpe Mason. It was wonderful having you here.
Thank you.
Y'all take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye. I thought it went well.
I thought it went very well. It was fascinating. I'm so thrilled to have been able to learn about her. I knew her name, but I didn't really know much about her. So, oh, very
I know.
inspiring. Yeah.
It's amazing what a remarkable person. I mean, what she did is more than 3 or 4 people might do in a lifetime, and she did in a single one. So I
Yes.
just am so glad people are learning more about her. She really deserves that. So,
Yes.
yeah, we had a good group. She was excellent.
She was excellent, really excellent.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it was really, really went well. Thank you so much for knowing that we could do this.
Well, thank you for your support, Anne. It was
Yes.
really a pleasure. So I will see you again soon, I'm sure.
Yes, very soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.